We can move data from an Amazon SQS queue to a Pulsar topic using the Amazon SQS source connector. First, we'll create the Amazon SQS queue. We'll need the region and the queue name, and then we'll add the required permissions for a user that are needed to be able to read those messages. Next, we'll prepare the StreamNative Cloud cluster, which will include creating a service account binding, and add any required permissions on our tenant and namespace. If you have the latest version of the UI, we'll be able to do all of this in the UI. Finally, we'll deploy the Amazon SQS source connector, and we'll test it out by writing a message to the Amazon SQS queue and viewing what that looks like inside of our topic. To get started, we will first create our Amazon SQS queue. I'm just going to call it myfirstqueue and leave all others as defaults. You may think that it would be possible to create the required permissions for a user here under define who can receive messages from the queue and say the specified AWS accounts or IAM users in this case, but in fact that won't create enough permissions. So we'll leave that for now, and then we'll manually create the permissions in just a bit. If I scroll down, I'll click Create Queue, and you're only going to need two things from this page. You'll need the name of your queue and also your region, which here is US East 2. To add the required permissions, I will click on Access Policy. I already have a user and IAM that I just need to provide permissions here. I'm going to click Edit under Access Policy, and when I scroll down, I'll go to the policy generator. But first, I will copy this resource. Go to Policy Generator. Let me paste in that resource here in ARN. And then in principle, I'm going to paste in the ARN of the user from IAM. Under Actions, there's 6 actions I need to add. The first is change message visibility, then create queue, delete queue, get queue attributes, get queue URL, and receive message. Finally, let me click Add Statement. These will now show up down here for my principal and my resource, and I'll click Generate Policy. Let me go ahead and copy this out. I mostly need what's in between the statement section. So I'm going to copy that section, click Close, and when I go back over here, I'm going to add an extra statement in besides the one that already exists. Adding the comma here, and then that is my new statement that's been added. Let me go ahead and fix this up just a bit. If I scroll down to the very bottom of the page, I'll go ahead and hit Save. You'll see that my principal here, my SQS user, now has permissions to this resource, and these are the 6 permissions that it has. When you deploy the connector, you'll also need an access key and a secret key for this particular user. I'm not going to go through that, but you will need to go get those out of IAM as well. We'll create the service account that will be used to run the source connector. Clicking on Service Accounts on the left, I then go to New Service Account, and I'm going to call it SQS Service Account, making sure not to select Super Admin. Clicking Confirm, it may take a few seconds for it to show up in the list. Mine's going to end up on the second page, so let me go to the second page, and here's SQS Service Account. We need to create a service account binding. I'll go to the far right and say Edit Service Account Bindings. I'll find the region that lists my cluster. I'm using the training cluster, so this is the region that is important for me, so I'll say Create that Service Account Binding and click Confirm. You should now see the service account binding show up in this list here. Next, we need to add the required permissions, but first I'm going to create a tenant and namespace. I'll create a new tenant called sqstenant, and of course it's going to be allowed on this cluster. And I'll click Confirm. Let me go ahead and find that tenant, and I'll create a new namespace in it called sqsnamespace, and click Confirm. When I click on the namespace, I'll go over to Policy, I'll click Add Role, selecting the service account that we created, and I'm going to provide it consume and produce permissions. Produce is probably enough since that's where we're going to be writing the messages to, but I'm also going to use the same service account when checking for messages. And then we will definitely need sources so we can deploy this connector into this tenant and namespace. Let's take a look at the Pulsarctl command that we'll use to deploy the Amazon SQS source connector. I haven't included any directions here on how to download Pulsarctl or how to configure it to point to your particular cluster. I'll include information in the description on that. But the key here is that we are currently logged into Pulsarctl using the service account that we created that has the service account binding. That way, when we deploy the source connector, it will deploy under those credentials. We're using Pulsarctl sources create and using the built-in version of SQS. Specified my tenant and namespace where we're going to deploy it to, and the name that's going to be provided to the source connector. The destination topic is where the data will be written. You should include the tenant and namespace as well as the name of the topic. In source config, you have to specify the AWS region and the queueName. You don't need to specify the AWS endpoint, but you will also need to specify the AWS credential plugin parameters, and that will be the access key and the secret key that you can get out of IAM for your particular user. And of course, that's the user that you also provided the required permissions inside of SQS. Take a note that there are single quotes around the entire source config. There are also backslashes before the double quotes for the access key and the secret key. So be very careful with setting up the source config here. Here I've pasted in the Pulsarctl sources create command, and when I execute this, you should see created SQS source successfully. Selecting your tenant and namespace, clicking on connectors and then sources, I see that it should say SQS source is now ready. We're ready to now test our source connector. One of the easiest ways to test your connector is to say send and receive messages. And in the message body, I'll just type in hello world from SQS. Click send message. And your connector should now say that the source has read one message from source and one message to Pulsar. We can now use a Pulsar consumer to read that message. Here we have a Pulsar consumer. I'm using the service account that we created called SQS service account, which I did provide consume permissions on our tenant and namespace. The topic is set to SQS tenant, SQS namespace, myfirstqueue, and we don't yet have a subscription, so it's possible that the first message out of that topic that we read, or that first message that went into the topic may get lost per the retention policies of Pulsar, but once we create that subscription, we of course would receive all future messages. Let me go ahead and right-click this, and we'll go ahead and say run SN consumer. And we should see that we get our first message, hello world from SQS.